So Mark Carney just built an alliance, not a trade deal, not a diplomatic partnership, not a joint statement of concern. An alliance, 40 nations, 6 continents, $1.5 billion in coordinated funding, and a single unified objective to build an economic system that functions without the United States. And this isn't a proposal. This isn't a white paper. The agreements have been signed, the money has been allocated, and the first projects are already under construction. Warren Buffett's response to this is unlike anything he has said before about American economic power. When you hear what the Oracle of Omaha called this alliance, you'll understand why this isn't about Canada anymore. This is about whether the United States just lost the global economic order it built 80 years ago. Hit subscribe right now, because this is the most consequential economic story of our lifetime, and it's moving faster than anyone in Washington anticipated. Let me fill you in on what just happened, because the scale of this is almost impossible to comprehend in a single sitting. 3 days ago, Mark Carney stood in the conference center in Ottawa, flanked by the heads of state and senior representatives of 40 nations, and announced the formation of what he called the Global Economic Sovereignty Initiative, or GAC. The name is deliberately clinical. The substance is anything but. GAC is a formal treaty-backed multilateral alliance designed to create parallel economic infrastructure, trade routes, financial settlement systems, manufacturing supply chains, and resource distribution networks that operate entirely independently of the United States. The alliance includes the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, India, South Korea, Australia, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Norway, Singapore, Indonesia, Mexico, Chile, New Zealand, and 23 additional nations from every inhabited continent. Together, these 40 nations represent over 4.2 billion people, roughly 53% of the world's population. Their combined GDP exceeds 51 trillion, which represents approximately 47% of global economic output. And they have collectively committed $1.5 billion in seed funding to launch Jesse's first wave of infrastructure projects within the next 12 months. To put the membership in perspective, the only major economies not in Gs are the United States, China, and Russia. And the reason China and Russia aren't included is deliberate and strategic. Carney designed G specifically as an alliance of democracies and market economies, excluding authoritarian states, so that the initiative cannot be dismissed as an anti-American bloc aligned with American adversaries. This isn't BRICS. This isn't the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is America's own allies. Its treaty partners, its trading partners, its intelligence sharing partners, building an economic system designed to function without it. The signing ceremony itself was a carefully choreographed display of global unity. The Japanese prime minister sat next to the Indian prime minister. The president of the European Commission sat next to the Brazilian president. The Saudi finance minister sat next to the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund chief. Nations that rarely agree on anything, that have competing interests on trade, immigration, and security, sat in the same room, signed the same document, and committed to the same 4-pillar architecture. Carney had spent 14 months in private diplomatic consultations, flying to 31 capitals to personally negotiate the terms with each government. The level of coordination required to get 40 nations to agree on anything, let alone $1 trillion economic restructuring, is extraordinary. The fact that it happened tells you how deeply the participating nations feel the threat of American economic coercion. The Financial Times called it the most significant multilateral agreement since the Paris Climate Accords. The Economist went further, calling it the first credible alternative to the American-led economic order since Bretton Woods. And the Wall Street Journal, in an editorial that shocked its own conservative readership, wrote, "The question is no longer whether America's allies are diversifying away from American economic infrastructure. The question is whether America understands what it has lost." That distinction is what makes GSI so devastating to Washington. You can dismiss a Chinese-led bloc as adversarial posturing. You can frame Russian economic initiatives as geopolitical maneuvering. You cannot dismiss an alliance of 40 democracies that includes Japan, Germany, the EU, the UK, India, Australia, South Korea, and Brazil is anything other than a direct, coordinated, rational response to American economic policy. These nations didn't join GSI because they hate America. They joined because they can no longer afford to depend on America. Now, this is where it gets wild, because GSSE isn't a concept, it's an architecture, and the architecture is already being built. The $1.5 billion initial fund is allocated across 4 pillars, each targeting a different dimension of American economic leverage. And each pillar connects directly to initiatives that individual nations have already been building. The first pillar is the Global Trade Settlement Network, allocated $380 million. This is the financial backbone of the alliance, a multilateral clearing and settlement system that allows member nations to conduct trade in any mutually agreed currency without routing through the U.S. dollar clearing system. It builds directly on Canada's Cup Euro settlement mechanism, the CSA Commonwealth platform, and the digital energy trading infrastructure from the CSSE project. The network integrates these existing systems into a single interoperable platform that any GSSE member can plug into within 90 days. The Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Reserve Bank of India, and the Bank of Japan have all committed technical resources, liquidity support, and dedicated staff to the project. India's UPI International Payment System provides the consumer-level transaction layer. Japan's financial technology sector provides the security architecture. The European Central Bank provides the institutional credibility that makes the network attractive to sovereign wealth funds and institutional investors. The target handling $2 trillion in non-dollar trade settlement within 24 months. That represents approximately 12% of current global trade volume, enough to create genuine momentum without triggering a disorderly dollar sell-off. The network doesn't kill the dollar. It simply makes the dollar one option among several. And in the world of reserve currencies, one option among several is the death of monopoly. The second pillar is the Sovereign Supply Chain Initiative, allocated $420 million. This is the manufacturing and industrial component, a coordinated effort to build supply chains among JSI member nations that do not depend on American components, American logistics networks, or American intellectual property licensing. The initiative begins with a comprehensive vulnerability mapping exercise across all 40 member nations, identifying every critical supply chain that currently has a single point of failure dependency on any external power, including not just the United States, but also China. The first wave of funded projects targets 5 sectors: semiconductor packaging in Japan and South Korea, replacing dependency on American testing and design software, pharmaceutical active ingredient manufacturing in India and Ireland, reducing dependency on American-controlled drug patents and distribution networks, critical mineral processing in Canada and Australia, building refining capacity for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements that currently flows through Chinese or American processing facilities, EV battery production across a distributed network of Canadian, European, and East Asian facilities, and agricultural biotechnology in Brazil and India, reducing dependency on American seed and fertilizer corporations. Each project has a designated lead nation, a co-investing partner, and a shared intellectual property framework that ensures no single member nation can withhold access from others. The third pillar is the Energy Independence Corridor, allocated $350 million. This extends Canada's CSC energy bypass infrastructure into a global network connecting producers and consumers across every major energy market. The initiative funds pipeline connections between Canada and Atlantic shipping routes, port upgrades in India, Brazil, and West Africa, LNG terminal expansions in Japan and South Korea, and digital energy trading platforms that allow GSI members to trade energy resources among themselves at transparent auction-based global market prices without routing through American exchanges, American pipelines, or American-controlled pricing benchmarks like WTI. Saudi Arabia's participation is the centerpiece. The world's largest oil exporter has committed to making a minimum of 15% of its output available to GSI members in non-dollar settlement, formalizing the petrodollar break that the Treasury's earlier ban accelerated. The UAE has matched with a 12% commitment. Norway, the largest oil producer in Europe, has committed its entire North Sea output to GSI pricing mechanisms. Combined, these commitments represent approximately 8 million barrels per day of oil production priced and settled outside the dollar system. The fourth pillar is the Democratic Innovation Fund, allocated $350 million. This is the strategic differentiator that separates GZ from every previous multilateral economic initiative. The fund invests in AI research, quantum computing, clean energy technology, and advanced manufacturing processes across member nations, creating a shared innovation ecosystem that reduces dependency on American technology platforms, American research institutions, and American intellectual property. Participating institutions include the Max Planck Society in Germany, CERN in Switzerland, the Indian Institutes of Technology, the University of Tokyo, the Weizmann Institute in Israel, KISTED in South Korea, and a consortium of Canadian and Australian research universities. The fund operates on an open science model where all research outputs are shared among member nations, eliminating the licensing fees and access restrictions that American tech companies and universities have increasingly used as leverage. The fund's first major project, a GS-wide AI research initiative, focused on building large language models, semiconductor design tools, and cybersecurity systems that are not dependent on American cloud infrastructure, American training data, or American export controls. $1.5 billion, 4 pillars, 40 nations. And every single dollar is directed at building systems that make American economic leverage irrelevant. The scale is staggering. But the truly remarkable thing is how modest the initial investment is relative to the ambition. $1.5 billion is a rounding error for an alliance whose members have a combined GDP of $51 trillion. The seed funding is designed to build the foundations. The real investment, the trillions that will flow through these systems once they're operational, comes from the private sector. Companies like Toyota, Honda, Samsung, Siemens, Novo, Nordisk, and now Berkshire Hathaway, which are already routing their investment decisions through GCI nations because the economics demand it. The $1.5 billion builds the plumbing. The global economy does the rest. Carney's address at the signing ceremony was 26 minutes long. He spoke without notes, standing at a podium beneath the flags of all 40 member nations arranged in a semicircle behind him. The image, broadcast live to an estimated global audience of 400 million people, was deliberate in its symbolism: one man, one podium, and 40 flags representing over half the world's population. The tone was not triumphant. It was somber, almost mournful, as if Carney understood that what he was building was necessary precisely because something else, something valuable, had been lost. He opened by saying, "This is not an alliance we wanted to build. This is an alliance we were forced to build." Every nation in this room has spent the past 2 years watching the United States weaponize the economic systems that we all built together. Tariffs used as punishment for lawful trade decisions, dollar access revoked as a weapon against financial sovereignty, pipeline threats deployed as coercion against energy independence, manufacturing extortion through trade policy instability that makes it impossible for any company to plan beyond a single election cycle. We have been patient, we have been diplomatic, we have used every bilateral channel, every multilateral forum, every personal relationship available. We have exhausted every possible alternative, and the aggression has only escalated. He paused for 6 seconds. The room was silent. Every camera in the building focused on his face. And then he said, "Today, patience ends and architecture begins." The room erupted, not in applause at first, but in something deeper. The sound of chairs pushing back as delegations rose to their feet. The Japanese delegation, the Indian delegation, the European Union representatives, the British delegation, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Australia, one by one. And then, all at once, the representatives of 40 nations stood. The ovation lasted over 2 minutes. That line, "Patience ends and architecture begins," is the line that will define this moment in economic history because it captures the fundamental shift that has occurred. For 2 years, America's allies absorbed the tariffs, negotiated through the threats, filed diplomatic protests, issued carefully worded statements of concern, and waited for policy reversals that never came. That era is over. The 40 nations in Ottawa are no longer waiting for America to change. They are building a world that doesn't require America to change. And the distinction between those two postures is the difference between diplomacy and infrastructure. Diplomacy can be reversed with a phone call. Infrastructure cannot be reversed with anything. And then came the response that made this a global financial earthquake. Warren Buffett's statement arrived within hours of the signing ceremony. In a response released through Berkshire Hathaway's official channel, the 94-year-old billionaire delivered what may be the most historically significant statement of his career. He said, "I have been alive for every major realignment of the global economic order since Bretton Woods. I watched the collapse of the gold standard. I watched the rise of the petrodollar. I watched the fall of the Soviet Union. I watched China enter the WTO. And I am telling you now, clearly and without reservation, what happened in Ottawa today is the most significant restructuring of the global economic system since 1944. This is not a trade dispute. This is the beginning of a new economic world order, and the United States is not in it." Then he said, "Four nations representing $51 trillion in GDP just signed an agreement to build economic infrastructure that bypasses America. These aren't adversaries. These are our allies, our partners, our friends. The nations that have held dollars in their reserves bought our treasury bonds and supported our financial system for 80 years. And they've just told us collectively that they're building something new. If you don't find that alarming, you don't understand what's happening." And finally, the United States built the post-war economic order. It was the greatest achievement in the history of economic statecraft, and we are dismantling it ourselves, tariff by tariff, sanction by sanction, threat by threat. Nobody defeated us. We are doing this to ourselves. I need you to understand the weight of those words. Warren Buffett has lived through and invested through every major global economic shift of the past 70 years. He has seen currencies collapse, empires fall, and entire economic systems restructure themselves from the ground up. He was investing when the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971. He was investing when OPEC weaponized oil in 1973. He was investing through the Latin American debt crisis, the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com crash, the 2008 global financial crisis, and COVID. For him to compare Gessie to Bretton Woods, the 1944 conference that literally created the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the global dollar system tells you the scale at which he sees this unfolding. This isn't a trade spat. This isn't a diplomatic friction. This isn't Buffett's assessment, a once in 80 years restructuring of the fundamental architecture of how the global economy operates. Buffett has never compared any event in his lifetime to Bretton Woods, not the collapse of the gold standard, not the 2008 financial crisis, which he called an economic Pearl Harbor, not CO, which he called a freight train that you didn't see coming, not the rise of China, which he acknowledged as transformational. Nothing in 7 decades of public commentary has warranted the Bretton Woods comparison until now. And then Buffett revealed something that shook the financial world to its core. Berkshire Hathaway has committed to investing directly in GSI-linked infrastructure projects. Specifically, Berkshire is taking positions in the Global Trade Settlement Network's technology platform, the Sovereign Supply Chain Initiative, semiconductor and pharmaceutical supply chain projects, and the Energy Independence Corridors port expansion programs in India, Brazil, and the Canadian Atlantic coast. The estimated commitment north of $8 billion over the next 5 years, making Berkshire the single largest private sector investor in the GSI architecture. Berkshire has also accelerated its ongoing shift away from U.S. dollar-denominated assets, reducing Treasury holdings by an additional $60 billion in the quarter following the Ottawa signing and redeploying that capital into Japanese yen, Canadian dollar, euro, and Indian rupee denominated instruments. When combined with earlier reductions, Berkshire's total Treasury position has declined by over $120 billion from its peak 18 months ago. For context, that means the most successful American investor in history has moved over $100 billion out of American government debt and into the currencies and infrastructure of nations building alternatives to the American system. An anonymous Berkshire board member told the Financial Times, "Warren has said privately that JSA is the most important investment thesis of his career. He believes the center of gravity in the global economy is shifting away from the United States for the first time since World War II. And he intends to position Berkshire on the right side of that shift." He doesn't enjoy saying that, but the math doesn't care about patriotism. Think about that for a moment. The most successful American investor in history is investing $8 billion in an alliance specifically designed to bypass America. He's reducing his exposure to U.S. Treasury bonds by tens of billions. He's increasing his exposure to the currencies of nations, building alternatives to American economic infrastructure. The Oracle of Omaha has looked at the future and concluded that the future runs through Ottawa, Tokyo, New Delhi, London, and Riyadh, not Washington. And when Buffett makes a conclusion with that much conviction and that much capital behind it, the conclusion becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because every institutional investor in the world watches what Buffett does and follows. Now, let me show you why Washington's response has been so chaotic. Because the American political establishment is confronting something it has never faced before, a world that isn't asking for American permission. The White House issued a statement calling GSI a hostile economic bloc that threatens the stability of the international order. But that framing collapsed within hours because the international order the White House was referencing was the very order that America built and the GSI's 40-member nations had loyally supported for 80 years. The nations signing the Ottawa Agreement aren't threatening the international order. They're building a new one because the existing one is being weaponized against them. The British Foreign Secretary responded to the White House statement with a single sentence that went viral. An alliance of 40 democracies is not a hostile bloc. It is a mirror. Trump posted 14 times on Truth Social in 4 hours, calling Carney the most dangerous man in the Western world and threatening total economic war against any nation that participates in JC. He called Japan ungrateful, India disloyal, and the European Union a puppet of Canadian manipulation. He threatened to withdraw the United States from NATO, revoke Five Eyes intelligence sharing, and impose 100% tariffs on all goods from JC member nations. But every single one of those threats is hollow, and every government in the alliance knows it. You cannot wage total economic war against 40 nations that represent 47% of global GDP without destroying your own economy in the process. American exports to JC member nations total over $1.8 trillion annually. American companies operate over 12,000 facilities in JC countries. American pension funds hold trillions in JC nation equities. Sanctioning the alliance would trigger the worst economic crisis in American history, and it would be entirely self-inflicted. Congressional reaction was the most revealing indicator of the depth of the problem. Republican senators who had supported every tariff, every pipeline threat, every dollar weaponization, and every trade restriction that cumulatively led to GS creation were suddenly confronted with the consequences of 2 years of economic aggression. Senator Lindsey Graham called the alliance deeply concerning, but when pressed by reporters could not articulate a single specific countermeasure. Senator Marco Rubio acknowledged that our trade posture has created an opening that our competitors are exploiting, though notably, he could not name any competitor because GS members are not competitors. They are allies. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee requested an emergency classified briefing from the State Department. The briefing reportedly lasted 3 hours and concluded with no actionable recommendations. An anonymous committee staffer told Politico there was no plan, there was no counter strategy. There was a 3-hour conversation that ended with everyone staring at each other. Democrats were equally shaken, but for different reasons. Senator Elizabeth Warren said, GS proves that the damage from this administration's trade policy is now structural and possibly irreversible. Senator Chris Murphy called the alliance the most predictable and most preventable diplomatic catastrophe in American history. Senator Tim Kaine, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, said what everyone in the room was thinking. We pushed our friends away, and they found each other. The American business community's response was immediate and panicked. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued a statement calling GSI a direct threat to American commercial interests and demanding emergency trade negotiations. The Business Round, representing the CEOs of America's 200 largest corporations, issued a separate statement urging immediate de-escalation of trade hostilities. J.P. Morgan CEO called for a fundamental reassessment of American trade strategy. But negotiations require leverage, and leverage requires dependency, and GSI is specifically designed at its architectural level to eliminate dependency on the United States. You cannot negotiate with a counterparty that no longer needs anything you have. That's not a negotiation, that's a monologue. And here's where the story becomes truly existential. Because GSI doesn't just challenge American trade policy, it challenges something far deeper. It challenges American structural power, the invisible architecture that has made the United States the indispensable nation for 80 years. For 80 years, the United States has occupied a unique position in the global economy. It controlled the reserve currency that every nation needed for trade. It operated the clearing systems through which every major financial transaction was settled. It set the trade rules that determined who could sell what to whom. It hosted the institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the WTO that governed global economic cooperation, and it maintained the military alliances that provided the security umbrella under which the entire system operated. This structural power meant that even when American policy was aggressive, erratic, or unfair, other nations had no choice but to participate, absorb the costs, and continue engaging with the system because the American-built system was the only system that existed. There was no exit. There was no alternative. There was no plan B. GSI is plan B. It creates a second system, not a rival to the American system in the Cold War sense, not a hostile challenge from adversaries, but a parallel architecture built by allies that allows nations to trade, settle, manufacture, innovate, and exchange energy without touching any American-controlled infrastructure. It's not trying to defeat the American system. It's not trying to destroy the American system. It's trying to make the American system optional. And optional is the most dangerous word in the vocabulary of hegemonic power, because the moment the American system becomes optional is the moment nations start asking why they're still using it. And the answer for 80 years has been because there's no alternative. GSI is the alternative. Built by democracies, funded by allies, staffed by the best financial minds in the world, designed by a former central banker who understands the plumbing of global finance at a level that perhaps no other living person matches, and backed by $1.5 billion in immediate funding, with a pipeline of hundreds of billions more in private sector investment following Buffett's lead. Canada's role in all of this is what makes it historically extraordinary. Canada is not a superpower. It's not a military hegemon. It's not even a particularly large economy by global standards, ranking 9th in the world by GDP. But Canada has done something that no nation has ever done before. It has organized America's own allies into a structured, funded, treaty-backed economic alliance that bypasses American infrastructure entirely. The Canadian Prime Minister, a former governor of both the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, the only person in history to have led the central banks of two G7 nations, has essentially redesigned the global financial architecture from a middle powers position. He did it not with threats or military power, but with competence, credibility, and the one insight that no amount of force can override. Sovereign nations will always choose independence over dependency when given a credible path. Buffett addressed this directly in his statement. He said, Mark Carney didn't build this alliance with aircraft carriers or nuclear weapons. He built it with spreadsheets, treaties, and the simple insight that nations will always choose sovereignty over dependency when given a credible path. He gave 40 nations that path, and every single one of them took it. That should terrify Washington, not because the alliance is hostile, but because it's rational, and rational decisions are the ones that stick. Even if the United States reverses every tariff, lifts every sanction, and restores every bilateral relationship tomorrow, GSI doesn't dissolve. The Global Trade Settlement Network doesn't shut down its servers. The Sovereign Supply Chain Initiative doesn't halt the semiconductor and pharmaceutical projects that are already under contract. The Energy Independence Corridor doesn't close the ports that are being expanded in India and Brazil. The Democratic Innovation Fund doesn't return its research grants to the 60 universities that have already begun their work. These are infrastructure projects with multi-year timelines, treaty-backed governance structures, institutional staffing, and operational momentum that exist independently of any American policy change. The treaties alone make dissolution nearly impossible. 40 nations signed binding agreements with ratification requirements in their respective legislatures. Unwinding those agreements would require simultaneous action by 40 governments, many of which have domestic political constituencies that now strongly support the alliance. In Canada, GSI approval ratings are at 89%. In India, 91%. In the United Kingdom, 78%. These numbers make political reversal impossible, even if diplomatic conditions changed overnight. You can't unbuild a settlement network that is already processing transactions. You can't unsign 40 treaties that have already been ratified. You can't uninvest $1.5 billion that has already been allocated, contracted, and deployed. You can't unhire the thousands of staff who are already operating the infrastructure. And you can't unteach the lesson that the alliance taught every nation on earth, that American economic infrastructure can be weaponized and that alternatives can be built. 40 nations didn't build this because they wanted to. They built it because they felt they had to. And infrastructure built out of necessity doesn't get dismantled when the threat recedes. It gets expanded. It gets strengthened. It becomes the new normal. And the new normal is a world where the United States is one economic power among several, not the economic power on which everything else orbits. This is the most important point in the entire story, and I need you to understand it clearly. GSI is not reversible. The question is no longer whether the United States can prevent a parallel economic system from being built. It's already being built. The question is no longer whether the United States can stop a parallel economic system from emerging. That moment is past. The architecture is already being poured in concrete and coded into servers. The real question now is whether the United States can adapt to a world in which it no longer controls the central nervous system of global commerce. And at this moment, there is no serious evidence that Washington has even begun to confront that reality. Warren Buffett captured the historical gravity of this shift more clearly than anyone else. He reminded the world that America did not inherit the modern economic order, it built it. At the Bretton Woods conference, the United States designed the monetary framework that stabilized the post-war world. Through the Marshall Plan, it rebuilt shattered economies. Through the dollar system, it created liquidity for global trade. Through the IMF, World Bank, and WTO architecture, it institutionalized cooperation. These were not accidents of history. They were acts of vision, discipline, and extraordinary statecraft. But systems built on trust survive only as long as that trust remains intact. Over the past 2 years, America's closest allies have watched economic access become conditional, financial infrastructure become political leverage, and trade rules become subject to electoral cycles. When access feels reversible, nations begin designing redundancy. When rules feel unstable, partners begin building alternatives, not out of hostility, but out of necessity. And history is unambiguous on this point. Once a parallel system reaches operational scale, the original system never regains uncontested dominance. Monopolies do not collapse overnight, they erode. They fragment. They become one option among several. And in global finance, one option is not supremacy, it is competition. So here is what actually happened. Mark Carney convened 40 nations representing 4.2 billion people and more than $51 trillion in combined GDP and launched a $1.5 billion treaty-backed initiative to construct economic infrastructure that functions independently of the United States. A global settlement network designed to transact beyond dollar clearing, supply chains engineered to eliminate single-point American dependencies, energy corridors priced outside traditional U.S. benchmarks, an innovation fund structured to reduce reliance on American technology platforms and intellectual property regimes. The agreements are signed, the capital is allocated, the first infrastructure projects are already underway. And Buffett, the most disciplined capital allocator of the modern era, compared this moment to Bretton Woods itself. He called it the most significant restructuring of the global economic system since 1944. He warned that the United States is not being defeated by rivals, but is weakening its own architecture, tariff by tariff, sanction by sanction, threat by threat. Then he did something more powerful than commentary. He moved capital. Billions committed into the alliance's infrastructure. Tens of billions reallocated out of U.S. treasuries. Not symbolism positioning, No external empire forced this shift. No adversary engineered it. This was a reaction to volatility, to uncertainty, to leverage deployed too often and too broadly. 40 nations, 4 structural pillars, $1.5 billion in seed capital, and trillions in potential follow-through. Not a press release, not a diplomatic protest. Infrastructure. The global center of economic gravity does not move dramatically. It moves gradually until one day everyone realizes it has already shifted. And when architecture replaces patience, reversals become almost impossible. This is not about Canada. It is about whether the economic order built in 1944 just entered its competitive era. Watch this carefully, because the center of gravity is moving and it does not appear to be slowing down.